Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active. That way he could race against Brexton. To have that moment of symbolization for Kyle and just see Brexton standing there, there's a moment of, wow, he's gone. And we're not going to get him.
Kyle Busch was the kind of driver people believed would always be there. Not because he was ordinary, but because he was the exact opposite. He was too intense, too competitive, too relentless, too accomplished to ever feel temporary. For years, NASCAR fans watched him do what almost nobody else could do: win across every level, fight through pressure, silence critics, and keep showing up with that same unmistakable fire. He was one of those rare competitors whose name did not just belong to a generation. It felt stitched into the sport itself. And that is exactly why the ending felt impossible. Because what happened to Kyle Busch was not the kind of ending people expected for a driver who had built a career around surviving pressure, speed, and chaos. It did not come with warning lights that the entire world could see. It did not arrive in the way people imagine tragedy in motorsports usually arrives. Instead, it came fast, quietly, and in a way that left even those closest to him struggling to understand how everything could change so suddenly. Now, for the first time in a truly personal way, Kurt Busch has opened the door on what those final days meant to him. Not just as a fellow NASCAR champion, not just as someone who knew Kyle better than the public ever could, but as a brother trying to process a loss that still feels too heavy to put into words. And what Kurt revealed was not just sad. It was devastating. Because the real heartbreak of Kyle Busch's final days is not only how they ended. It is what they interrupted. It is what they cut short. It is what Kyle was still fighting for, still planning for, and still reaching toward when everything suddenly stopped. And once you hear Kurt Busch explain that part, the entire story hits differently. Before we get into exactly what Kurt revealed, you have to understand the bond these two brothers shared, because without that, the emotion behind Kurt's words does not land with its full weight. For most fans, the Busch brothers were one of the most unforgettable sibling stories NASCAR has ever seen. Two elite competitors. Two powerful personalities. Two men raised in the same racing culture, shaped by the same family, and driven by the same hunger to prove themselves. They were brothers, but on the track, they were also rivals. And not the kind of rivals who politely stayed out of each other's way. They raced hard, carried pride, and forced one another to become sharper, tougher, and more fearless. Long before the championships, the national attention and the records, there were just two kids racing anything they could. That memory is one of the first places Kurt went when he finally spoke publicly after Kyle's death. He did not begin with statistics. He did not begin with trophies. He began with childhood, with shared memories, with the roots of a relationship that existed long before fame complicated it. In his first public statement, Kurt remembered the years they spent racing together from the earliest days, and then he said the line that told everyone how deep the wound really was. That simple sentence carried more truth than any carefully polished tribute ever could. Because it was not the voice of a public figure trying to craft a statement for headlines. It was the voice of a brother whose entire history had suddenly been split into a before and after. Before the loss. After the loss. Before Kyle was still here. After the impossible became real. What makes that grief even harder to absorb is how joyful things had looked not long before. Earlier in the year, Kurt had experienced one of the proudest moments of his life when he entered NASCAR's Hall of Fame, and Kyle had been right there beside him. That moment now carries an entirely different emotional weight. It was supposed to be a family celebration, a reminder of how far they had both come, how much they had accomplished, how deeply their names were woven into the story of the sport. Instead, in hindsight, it became something almost unbearable, one of the last major public memories of them together before everything changed. And that is where this story becomes more than just a sports tragedy. Because what Kurt eventually revealed about Kyle's final days was not only about how a medical crisis unfolded. It was about how quickly an active life can be interrupted even when the future still feels wide open. According to reporting after Kyle Busch's death, he died at 41 after severe pneumonia progressed into sepsis. His death certificate, as reported publicly, said he had been experiencing symptoms of bacterial pneumonia for days to weeks before sepsis set in. It further stated that the complications ultimately involved hemorrhagic shock and disseminated intravascular coagulation, and the manner of death was listed as natural. That timeline is part of what makes this so hard to process. Days to weeks. That phrase alone says so much. It tells you there was no long public goodbye. No season-long farewell where fans or family slowly prepared themselves for what was coming. No obvious end-of-the-road story that everyone could see building in real time. Instead, there was motion, normalcy, activity, routine, and then an abrupt collapse into something fatal. In NASCAR, people understand danger better than most. They know the risks of speed, impact, and split-second disaster. But this was different. This was not a loss that unfolded in front of a grandstand. It was not tied to the kind of visible violence people instinctively associate with racing. That alone made it feel surreal. A man who had survived the harshest competitive environment in motorsports, who had built his identity around toughness and endurance, was suddenly gone because an illness spiraled into overwhelming complications. But even that is only part of the story. Because the deepest emotional truth did not come from the medical reporting. It came from Kurt. When Kurt later appeared in an emotional clip reflecting on Kyle, what he said completely reframed the story. He spoke about fatherhood and how it had changed Kyle. He explained that Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active so that one day he could race against his son Brexton. Then Kurt tied that dream back to the lessons their father had taught both brothers. And in one of the most painful moments of all, Kurt described seeing Brexton there and realizing, with visible emotion. That one sentence may be the most revealing thing Kurt has said. Because suddenly, this story stops being only about a loss and becomes about unfinished life. It becomes about interrupted fatherhood. Interrupted plans. Interrupted legacy. Interrupted future. That is what Kurt revealed that official statements never fully could. Yes, people learned what the medical cause of death was. Yes, the public came to understand how quickly severe pneumonia and sepsis can become catastrophic. But Kurt revealed something deeper than medical facts. He revealed what Kyle was still holding onto when he was taken away. He still had something ahead of him that mattered. He still had something he wanted to do. He still had a future he could imagine clearly enough to talk about it. And that future involved his son. That detail changes the emotional architecture of the entire story. Because now this is no longer simply the tragedy of a champion lost too soon. It is the tragedy of a father whose next chapter had already begun to take shape in his mind. Kurt did not present Kyle as someone winding down, fading away, or quietly preparing to leave the spotlight. He described him as someone who still had a reason to keep going. Someone whose love for racing had become linked to something even more personal than trophies. The chance to share that world with Brexton in the most direct way possible. That is why Kurt's breakdown resonated so widely. He was not just crying over what had happened. He was grieving what would now never happen. And that kind of grief is especially brutal, because it is not limited to memory. It reaches forward. It imagines the birthdays, races, conversations, milestones, and moments that will never come. It forces a person not only to mourn what they lost, but to mourn what the one they loved was still becoming. The more you sit with Kurt's words, the more devastating they become. Because in that moment, he was not describing Kyle as a myth, or a stat line, or a sports icon trapped inside a tribute package. He was describing him as a father who still had plans. As a son shaped by his own father's teachings. As a man whose ambitions were no longer only about himself, but about passing something down. And that is where the story moves from shocking to heartbreaking. Because if Kyle had already achieved everything and simply faded into retirement, the pain would still be enormous. But that is not what Kurt described. Kurt described momentum, intention, future. Kyle was still moving forward, still active, still imagining what came next. That forward motion was also reflected in what Richard Childress later revealed. According to Childress, a press conference at Michigan had originally been intended to announce Kyle Busch's return to Richard Childress Racing for the 2027 season. Childress said the two had recently spoken with confidence about performance, about the direction of the cars, and about the possibility of making the chase. He even described how painful it was to walk into that media room knowing Kyle was supposed to have been there beside him. That detail adds another layer of sadness that is almost impossible to ignore. Because again, it tells us the same thing Kurt's emotional comments told us from another angle. Kyle Busch was not living like a man at the edge of the road. He was still making plans for the road ahead. He was still part of the future, in his own mind, in his team owner's mind, in his family's mind, in the sport's mind. That is what makes this story so painful. It is not only that Kyle died. It is that he died while life was still actively unfolding around him. He was not a finished chapter being gently closed. He was a chapter still being written. And Kurt, of all people, seemed to understand the cruelty of that better than anyone. In the same emotional reflection, Kurt also spoke about how thin the line can be between glory and calamity in NASCAR, and how when loss comes, the NASCAR family instinctively knows how to come together. Those words were not just about the sport's public rituals of mourning. They were about survival. They were about how people inside this world carry pain when there are no easy answers. That communal grief became visible in the tributes that followed. NASCAR paused to honor Kyle. Fans, teams, and family members gathered in shared sorrow. Kurt stood with his parents, with Samantha, with Brexton and Lennox, and with everyone else trying to process the scale of the loss. It was one of those moments where racing stopped feeling like entertainment and started feeling like a public memorial.
But even collective mourning has limits. Public tributes can honor a legend, but they cannot fully capture what it feels like to carry private grief. That is why Kurt's own words matter so much. They gave the audience something ceremonies cannot give. They showed what it sounds like when a person is not just honoring someone's memory, but trying to survive the reality of their absence. Kurt's pain was not abstract. It was attached to specific memories, specific hopes, specific family bonds. That is why it felt so real. When he spoke about Kyle's fatherhood, you could hear the emotional shift immediately. The entire story narrowed from NASCAR history to one family's heartbreak. The sport, the records, the headlines, they all suddenly took a step back. What remained at the center was a father and son, a brother and brother, a family trying to stand inside a reality none of them wanted. And maybe that is why this story continues to hit so hard even after the initial shock faded. Because Kyle Busch was one of the few athletes whose career had become almost too large to summarize. Reports after his passing again highlighted the enormity of what he had accomplished. 234 wins across NASCAR's National Series, status as one of the greatest drivers in the sport's history, and a competitive resume so extraordinary that many believe parts of it may never be matched. But strangely, the more you hear Kurt speak, the less those numbers seem to matter in the moment. Not because they are unimportant, but because grief has a way of stripping away the public scale of a person and returning them to what they were in the most intimate sense. To the world, Kyle Busch was a legend. To Kurt, he was also the little brother from Las Vegas. The brother who raced beside him. The brother who pushed him. The brother who shared a childhood, a father's lessons, and a lifetime of memories no highlight reel could ever fully show. That is what gives Kurt's words their real power. He is not narrating a headline. He is living through a rupture. And in doing so, he revealed the real tragedy of Kyle Busch's final days. Not just that his body failed under a rapidly escalating illness, but that his life was still full of movement when it happened. Still full of plans. Still full of people who needed him. Still full of roles he cared about deeply. In a way, that may be the hardest part of all to accept. A champion's death is tragic, but a father's unfinished future is heartbreaking in a different way. And Kurt gave voice to that heartbreak. He showed that this was not a story about someone disappearing slowly from the sport until people adjusted to the idea of life without him. It was a story about a man who was still very much in the middle of living. A man still tied to the future tense. That is why Kurt's breakdown did not feel like performance. It felt like truth. Messy truth. Unprocessed truth. The kind of truth that slips out when grief is still fresh enough to hurt in real time. And maybe that is also why his first public statement was so simple. He spoke about memories, about brotherhood, about racing together from childhood to the highest level of the sport, about Kyle's passion, determination, and love for family. And then, in words more powerful than any elaborate tribute, he admitted what all of it had done to him. Sometimes the most revealing words are the ones that say the least, because they leave no room to hide. And that is what Kurt's comments did. They stripped this story down to its emotional core. So when people ask what Kurt Busch really revealed about Kyle Busch's final days, the answer is not just a medical explanation, even though the medical facts are part of the story. The answer is that Kurt revealed the human cost of sudden loss. He revealed that Kyle was still planning to race, still dreaming about the future, still embracing fatherhood, still moving forward with intention, and still loved in a way that made his absence almost impossible to comprehend. He revealed that grief is not only about death. It is about interruption. It is about silence where there should have been more conversation. It is about empty space where there should have been more memories. It is about seeing a son and realizing the father who wanted to race beside him will never get that chance. And in that moment, Kurt made the whole world feel the weight of what had really been lost. Not just a driver. Not just a champion. A brother. A father. A future that had not finished unfolding. That is why his words landed so heavily. And that is why this story will stay with people. Because once you understand what Kurt was really saying, the tragedy of Kyle Busch's final days is no longer just about how they ended. It is about everything they were supposed to lead to. And that is a pain no statistic can measure. With that, we have come to the end of this story. If Kyle Busch's legacy meant something to you, and if Kurt Busch's words hit you as hard as they hit the racing world, take a moment to remember not just the champion people watched on Sundays, but the father, brother, and man his family is still learning to live without. And if you want more powerful NASCAR stories told with this same emotional depth, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, because the next story on your screen might be just as unforgettable.